Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and tonight I'm going to finish talking a little bit about um, reasons people will come in conflict with art. If you missed my last video on fear and creativity, I'll link it in the description. And this video is going to be, as you may have guessed by the title, about disgust and creativity, which I think is really the other major reason people come into conflict with art. And you don't have to look very far to see that happening today. As a matter of fact, if you watch your boy Zach's videos, a lot of the time when he's reviewing modern comics, he'll describe characters as being just gross. You know, you have these really weak-willed and men with no sense of self. It seems like they don't stand up for themselves. They just roll over whenever they're pushed. He finds it kind of gross. Frankly, so do I. And we see that in other places too. When EVS is accused of being, a racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe, a lot of the times people describe this as really gross and not fit for being out in society. Disgust, is a very, very common reason for people to take issue with art. Sometimes it has to do with the art, and sometimes, as we've seen, it has to do with the creator. And just like when people respond with fear, the fear response is rooted in a very important part of human psychology, and so is disgust. If you've watched Inside Out, you might remember the little green girl that represents disgust is primarily worried with their person getting sick, taking in something that can harm them. And that's the role of disgust in the mind. It's on the lookout for things that are poisonous or toxic, and trying to prevent us from taking them in. And that's a really good thing to be on the lookout for. Just as fear is kind of an emotion that is warning us of physical danger, immediate danger rather. Disgust is kind of warning us of more abstract dangers, more immaterial dangers. And I think that's one of the big reasons why in modern art, or modern entertainment, if you prefer, although I'm not really sure the barrier between these two is very meaningful, that's a whole nother topic. In modern art, in modern entertainment, we see disgust invoked much more than we see fear. As I said in my video on fear, we haven't, the last big fearful response to media was video games and violent video games. There's still a little bit of that, but by and large, we see disgust more often. I think we see it more often just because our society is so safe. So there's probably less need for fear overall. Again, off topic. And so that's a whole nother thing. By and large, we see disgust a lot more than we see fear and negative responses to media. And the disgust response that we see is almost always, worried that media will present ideas that are poisonous, that will poison people and somehow make them less healthy. And I have to admit that unlike when people respond to with fear to entertainment or to art, I am much less sympathetic, much less understanding of a disgust response, and that is simply because, um, you know, most forms of inoculation uh, are to prevent a disease. Still present the person with the disease. When the smallpox vaccine was being created, they didn't try and remove um, all disease from the people they were vaccinating. They just injected them with a disease that was a lot like smallpox, and that increased a person's resistance to smallpox. Um, so whereas a fear response is understandable, um, but not necessarily justified. A disgust response is not justified, and it's counterproductive, because people who are presented with ideas they strongly disagree with, um, tend to have their disagreement with those ideas reinforced rather than broken down. And the upshot of that is, if you have people who strongly who are already somewhat opposed to ideas you don't like racial bigotry, for example. If you have people who are that they kind of think racism is bad, but they're not very invested in that idea, and you present them with racism, whether it be in real life or in entertainment, most of the time you're going to bring out their opposition to racism more strongly. You're not going to weaken it. Even if you're presenting a sympathetic view of racism, they might gain sympathy for the characters who are racist, but they won't necessarily see that racism as a valid response. And the upshot of this is, if you want people to be more strongly anti-racist, getting rid of entertainment that you view as racist may actually be counterproductive, because you're getting rid of things that will galvanize people against the things that you hate. And beyond that, that assumes that okay. No, I think it is legitimate to bring up the response is not necessarily truthful either. And I suppose you could say both disgust responses and fear responses can be invalid, or can be faked, because a lot of the times when you look at an SJW, it really does feel like they're just it's just a performance. They're trying to get sympathy, or otherwise play act in order to leverage power against people they don't like, who aren't in their club, who won't fall in line with whatever the SJW wants. And that is a valid concern, and I think it's something you kind of have to weigh. You kind of have to take each case on the merits of the people presenting it. And a lot of the time, they won't present merits, which you can pretty much dismiss those, because they're probably not coming from a place of actual fear or actual disgust. They're just trying to manipulate. However, even beyond that, I think there are a lot of people like, say, um, Mark Wade or Kwanzaa Ojesia, the guy who does Black, from Black Mass Comics. I think they are actually, to a certain extent, legitimately disgusted by, books like Jawbreakers, Lost Souls. But even in those cases, that is criticism, I think, that is not useful to anyone, because a disgust response to art is, well, as I said, it's counterproductive. And to be perfectly honest, to ignore both the frightening things and the disgusting things in art is to ignore part of the human experience. Is to ignore things that give your art power to influence people, and influence people in positive ways. Not to frighten people into the shadows, or to gross them out and disgust them so they can't function in society, but to inoculate people against them. This is one of the great powers of art. One of the great things about entertainment is its ability to build up people's resistances to things that would be frightening, or to open their minds to things that they might think are disgusting, or to inoculate them against the worst excesses of the human condition, without actually putting them in dangerous or poisonous situations. And I think ultimately, as an artist or an entertainer, you do want to do that. I mean, it doesn't have to be, holy calling, or the first thing on your mind. But all the best art does do that. I mean, I keep dropping stuff. From the Odyssey all the way back in the old Grecian times, up to more modern classics like, say, Casablanca. All of these stories have presented very, very frightening and gross and really dark aspects of the human condition in ways that have not, clearly entertained. These are very, well, you may not necessarily find the Iliad super entertaining or the Odyssey super entertaining right now. They just don't match up with modern sensibilities, but people did once upon a time. That's why they haven't endured as long as they did. Anyways, the point is they didn't just entertain. They prepared people for long journeys and trying times and conflict and mixed loyalties and the excesses of human emotion and impulsiveness. And they couldn't do that if they were bound by the things that their culture found gross or frightening. So ultimately, if you aim to create entertainment or art, disgust is not a thing that you can allow to influence that. I mean, there may be good reasons to be disgusted by what you're tackling in your stories. But if you really believe in that story, if you really believe that you can do something good with those potentially very disgusting elements, then you need to commit to them. Like your boy Zach says, commit to the bit. Believe in your story enough to be willing to offend people a little with it. And I think that on the whole, that will give you a much better creative mindset than listening to the naysayers and bowing to social pressures. I'm not saying you should just be gross for the sake of being gross, or that you should try and frighten people for the sake of frightening people, unless you're telling a horror story. But there is, if you have a point to your story, and there's a point to the nasty aspects of your story, then don't let people bully you into cutting them out. So that's all I have to say today. Hope you enjoyed that. There's a like button, a subscribe button down below. Use them as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.